Chapter 17, Compton Ambassador. It was shortly after losing Buddha that I found myself in a Los Angeles County courtroom accused of the attempted robbery of a black and a Caucasian, both of whom were more broke than I was. Looking at these two characters, I wouldn't have needed a weapon or my fist to rob them. A simple boo would have sufficed. But being innocent made no difference. I was still charged with the crime. Luckily, my stepfather had a friend, a seasoned and skilled attorney, Johnny Cochran. His brilliance in the courtroom had my two accusers tripping over themselves with so many obvious lies that the district attorney was shaking his head in disgust. Even though Johnny told me not to worry and congratulated Bonnie for her splendid testimony, I was still worried about the unpredictable jury. The jurors re-entered the courtroom in silence, and the foreman read their verdict: not guilty. If this trial was a warning, I failed miserably to pay attention to it and continue promoting the Crips and my reputation like a politician lobbying for office. I could see no further than my limited intelligence allowed, and I relished the thug recognition even if it was for black-on-black genocide. My homeboys helped me make a street legend in their own griot recitals of my violent exploits. Often Mad Dog, David, Mad Bull, Black Johnny, Pee Wee, and others boasted about my exploits to elevate me to thug royalty. Whenever Mad Dog David addressed his homeboys, he would cry, my cousins, let Mr. Tookie speak. He is the Crip King. Black Johnny, an equal to Buddha in ruthlessness and flamboyant commander of the 43rd Street Crips, who rule with brass knuckles, would lay out the blue carpet when I showed up. When I ventured into any of the commander's strongholds, I was greeted as though I wore an imaginary crown. The respect I received inflated my head to the size of a watermelon. I earned it for oppressing other blacks. There is no bigger fool on earth than a man who destroys his own people. Meanwhile, since the San Diego summer camp was terminated, the would-be king was castleless and broke, and Bonnie was pregnant. So I went back to work with Bob Simmons in Compton. The boys' home, where I lived and worked, was a 2-story reddish house with 6 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, basement, dinette, living room, and a garage with a half-moon circular driveway. The place was huge, located off Santa Fe on Pine Street next to a mini mall that included a liquor store, barbershop, laundry, Italian takeout, record shop, soul food, restaurant, and a gas station across the street that also sold dairy products. Bob called this house the Ponderosa, but to the outside world, it would become known as the Red House or the Crip House. Living there were mostly young misfits with Crip backgrounds or an occasional Brim, Bounty Hunter, Van Ness Boy, Inglewood family, or Pyru. Also, Donald R. of the Van Ness Boys befriended me and even accompanied me on raids against the Pyrus, who were not their allies. Thus, two violently opposed individuals fought side by side. The Red House was located in a clean, quiet residential area. Several neighbors contacted their councilmen unsuccessfully to have the program moved. I met Bob's wife, Ethel, and their children, and also his parents, who welcomed me with open arms. His mother, Edith, and I had brief conversations about my future plans, though I couldn't speak about the subject with any clarity or conviction. Sometimes we talked about Bob's efforts to move troubled youth and how I could help him with the gang problem. But I was in no position to address the gang problem. I was a willing participant. As I recall, Bob was the first to initiate a gang truce between several Compton gangs. He consistently tried to alert mainstream society to accelerating gang membership, but they assumed he was crying wolf. In one such attempt, Bob set up a gang truce held in the backyard of the Red House. I attended with Blackie, Monk, and DN, the Oaks Park Boys leader. There were also some bounty hunters and Pyrus like Puddin', Tam, and others in attendance. No one appeared to be interested or listening to Bob, but rather they were sizing one another up for future sightings. If stairs could kill, all the gang members present would have been dead. The meeting was a fiasco, producing not even as much as a handshake among us. It didn't take long for me to familiarize myself with the different factions of Compton Crips. The Grandee Crips' hangout was around a block full of 2-story apartments on a street shaped like a J, ending in a cul-de-sac. Though some Crips lived in the Grandees, Most lived on the outskirts in the immediate area. My first day in the Grandies, I met Frosty, Bitter Dog Bruno, Mr. X, King Ning, Vamp, Salty, King Rat, Doug, Haas, and Popcorn from the Park Village. Though Mac Thomas was incarcerated, he had established a Crip force here that was effective in its propensity for violence and destruction that mirrored the West Side Crips and the East Side Crips. When I wasn't kicking it with the Grandies, I was in the garage at the Red House driving iron with the weights I had collected. When word was out that I lived in Compton, there were Crips showing up to meet me, drive iron, or both. The Red House was a quasi-Crip embassy, and I was the ambassador. Finding their way to the Red House from long distances were Mad Dog David, Big James, Jamel, Big Curtis, Lurch, Fat Riley, and plenty of others. A regular visitor, one in particular, was Cuba's Mr. Olympia winner, Sergio Oliva, who was unbelievable in size. Tapping his picture with my finger, I told little James, "Cuz, I'm going to be bigger than this cat." At the time, there were quite a few Crips and non-Crips who pumped iron and who were bigger than me. Seals, Poncho, Head, Bulldog, Raymond, Donnie Boy, Jamal, Big Bear, and the biggest of them all, Munson. The first time I saw Munson at Roosevelt Park, I couldn't believe my eyes. Buddha shrugged him off as a Goliath, ready to fall on his sword. Head told me once that Raymond idolized Munson and wanted badly to join the Avenues, but Munson objected. As a result, Raymond decided to create a junior version of the Avenues and called them the Cribs. Whether fact or fiction, it was obvious Raymond respected Munson because he spoke of him often. One day, a few of us drove over to where Munson, Bear, and Donnie Boy were driving iron in a garage on a U-shaped street off Avalon. Munson acted aloof, and when he did speak, he spoke down to Raymond. I asked Eddie H., "What was the problem here?" And he said, "Cuz, that's the way they trip all the time." Friend or no friend, I held no one in such high regard that I'd allow him or her to berate me without a comeback or a payback. After leaving that garage, I was determined to become bigger and stronger than Munson, but without ever having to be in prison. A few of my homeboys used to brag about how they planned to get yoked up whenever they went to prison. I was convinced I could become yoked while on the streets, so I started driving iron obsessively, and with phenomenal results. Driving iron with Little James was what helped me pack on muscle and set the stage for more size. At the age of 19, I had 19-inch arms that looked even larger due to my height of 5 feet 10 inches. To be yoked was a new word in my vocabulary. I could stand in front of a mirror listening to any James Brown song while back-arming a 175-pound curl bar from afternoon till dawn. To say the least, having yokes was an intimidation factor backed up with strength, treachery, and opportunity that served me well in head-up fights in life. My desire to fight was never for the sake of fighting, but rather to set an example for my homeboys and any opposition foolhardy enough to try me. When fisticuffs ruled and gang primacy, a Crip could boldly roam into forbidden territory, relying upon his fists, win or lose, to back him up. Although I was a traditionalist in street gang fighting, I wasn't a fool. I bought a 12-gauge shotgun for safety. It didn't take long for the Linwood cops patrolling in their all-white cars to target me with their petty harassment tactics. Bob said the cops had mentioned having received word from the Lenox Sheriff's Department and the Los Angeles Police Department about me being the leader of a gang called the West Side Crips. According to Bob, one cop said, "Tookie's kind can never change. He's antisocial, among others." That statement was the general consensus of many other cops on the West Side, but their opinion never mattered to me. I was never antisocial. I was selectively social and refused to socialize with just anybody. The cop's trite statement reminded me of the time when a county voodoo doctor had labeled me as antisocial and a 15-year-old revolutionary. Odd, because back then I couldn't even define revolutionary, yet alone comprehend its concepts. His analysis of me was a typical racist stereotype used to describe every homeboy I knew. Instead of defining me as a defiant teenager, his amateur opinion tagged me as a revolutionary. But I was instead a model for a future Crip prototype. Living in Compton, I needed a car bad, and Bob had an old buddy sell me his white two-door 1965 Chevy with a 396 engine and a 4-banger stick in the floor. With my Compton Crip homeboy Lee, I drove to the west side and appropriated a lowrider Chevy car and boldly stripped it in the Grandees and left it there. A week later, I had hydraulic lifts put in my car and I had a small black pirate's flag on an antenna to signify danger. The car itself was quickly becoming recognizable by rivals and by both Linwood and Compton Crips. With access to wheels, I entered the PJs, aka the Imperial Courts Projects, where I was introduced to AB, Anthony Braylock, commander of the PJ Crips, and his right-hand man, Poindexter. It was also where I met Beverly McGowan, the future mother of my son Stan. AB stayed in one of the many PJ apartments, along with the family practicing the religion of Islam. At 5 feet 9 inches and a medium build, AB was game for anything and was at war with the bounty hunters and the Eastside Bishops. By a Crip association, they were my rivals too. His lowrider 1957 gray and white Nomad station wagon was a magnet for his enemies to take pot shots at him whenever he traveled near Nickerson Gardens, where the bounty hunters lived. During several other trips over to the PJs, AB told me that all around the gymnasium were Crips. But on the other side, they weren't interested either in Crips or in becoming Crips. Fist fights were still in vogue, and that's what took place despite the presence of guns. The scenario was a trip because on the opposite side, there were youths our age partying with older brothers, uncles, and fathers, but most of them were rowdy and willing to fight. They had no qualms about betting on themselves, relatives, or any of us. Though most of the burly dudes I fought with were unknowns, driving them into the dirt only increased the myths about me. I was known as a knockout artist with one punch and was dubbed the dirtiest fighter on the continent. By no means was I comparable to Joe Louis, Muhammad Ali, or Mike Tyson. But back then, winning was required for me to set a standard in the name of Crip. High on arrogance, I drive to the opposite side of the PJs, then stop my car in the middle of the street, get out, and challenge whoever was present. If there were no takers, I stroll up to the crowd of dudes, then start sucker punching them. They thought exactly what I wanted them to think. Tookie's crazy. I was a spectacle, sporting a shiny bald head with sideburns and a goatee, dressed in blue overalls, army boots, no shirt, and with an oiled up body too slippery for an opponent to grab. It was AB Poindexter and their homeboys who applied consistent pressure that turned the other side into the Crips. With the PJs under the control of AB, they concentrated on the battles against their rivals. Whenever there were rumors of a potential attack, the PJs morphed into an armed fortress that would be suicidal for any rival to attempt to drive by. It was like trying to do a drive-by in the Nickerson Gardens, a death trap. During one of those false alarms, it was the first time I had ever seen nearly 100 Crips in mass with guns and rifles out in the open. It was unbelievable. On other nights, when we were hanging out getting high, an undercover cop would do a drive-by and holler out bounty hunter or bishop, then peel rubber as a hail of bullets chased the culprit. Minutes later, the PJs would be surrounded by an armada of patrol cars and helicopters hovering above with spotlights. It was never a surprise seeing the same undercover car that initiated the drive-by earlier showing up alongside the many other cop cars. I recall AB telling me those cops pull this crap off and on because they want us to ride down on the bounty hunters. It keeps them busy. Plus, he said, the cops were shooting blanks. I looked at him like he lost his mind and said, blanks? Hell, blanks don't ricochet off walls and put holes in cars. Yes, America, as unbelievable as it may seem, hood cops with impunity commit drive-bys and other lawless acts. It was common practice for them to abduct a Crip or bounty hunter and drop him off in hostile territory and then broadcast it over a loudspeaker. The predictable outcome was that the rival was either beaten or killed on the spot, which resulted in a cycle of payback. Cops would also inform opposing gangs where to find and attack a rival gang and then say, go handle your business. Like slaves, the gang did exactly what their master commanded. Had they not been fueled by self-hatred, neither Crips, bounty hunters, nor any other black gang would have been duped. The hood cops were pledged to protect and serve, but for us, they were not there to help, but to exploit us. And they were effective. With the cops' Machiavellian presence, the gang epidemic escalated. When gang warfare is fed and fueled by law enforcement, funds are generated for the so-called anti-gang units. Without gangs, these units would no longer exist. In the midst of the madness, my name was reverberating through much of Compton. Quite a few members of opposing gangs were offended. One night when I was in the PJs, a well-known Pyru named JB and several of his homeboys paid the Red House a visit. They showed up threatening the youngsters there. JB boldly left a message. "Tell Tookie I'm looking for him." I had to take JB's threat seriously because he showed up on my doorstep calling me out. He made it personal and offended my ego. I had to find him and make an example. While cruising with Norwood around Compton, I spotted JB and two females going into a liquor store. After parking, I approached JB and asked if he was looking for me. He responded, "Look here, brother, I don't even know you." But the moment I said I'm Tookie, his eyes became as big as golf balls. Moments later, he was stretched out on the cement as two females ran back inside the liquor store screaming for help. Later that night, Beverly and I were asleep in my recently obtained apartment across the street from the Red House when I was awakened by loud noises of people hollering Tookie. Thinking it was JB and his Pyru cronies retaliating, I jumped up and looked out the window. There were about 6 lowrider cars parked. Still groggy, I was able to make out Black Johnny, so I hollered down to him and his homeboys to hold down the racket. Although it was nighttime, I could still see Black Johnny's teeth shining with a devious smile. He was a darker, taller version of Buddha, and to say he was crazy was an understatement. He was so mean, it was said that when he went to prison, his homeboys celebrated and prayed he'd never get released. Loped out, unpredictably crazy, or not, Black Johnny was the commander of the Eastside 43rd Street Crips and would go to war at the drop of a hat. When I told him about what happened earlier, his first reaction was, "Well, I'll come back with an army so we can destroy them." Then he asked, "Is the man loony? Does he know who you are?" I told him, "It makes no difference. Whatever the problem is, I can handle it." After a few hours of bantering, snacking, and reminiscing about the Watts Festival, Black Johnny and his homeboys were ready to go. While leaving, they chanted out loudly, "Crip here," and they all threw up the hand signal he used to intentionally annoy me until I began putting him in a headlock and applied pressure till he ceased the madness. Yet, he was still one of the most reliable homeboys I knew. I recall thinking that Black Johnny would one day completely lose his mind because he was already beyond crazy. It was similar to my thought about Buddha not living long because of his extreme cruelty. But in both instances, I dismissed thoughts as quickly as I did of the individuals who wanted to be Crips but didn't fit the profile. Either way, Black Johnny was a true blue Crip, and other than Little James, he had a first-rate cachet of weaponry. The following night, around midnight, Lee and I were sitting at the kitchen table smoking weed while Beverly prepared a meal. I heard a loud noise and someone repeatedly calling my name. I thought it was the madman Black Johnny and his homeboys again outside, but I knew better when I heard glass breaking and the chorus of "Pyru, Pyru, fool." I opened up on them with an M1 rifle that sounded like a firecracker going off with each shot. It jammed, and I had to feed the rifle one bullet at a time. After the crowd of Pyrus dispersed in all directions, I saw JB slowly cruising by in his dark blue Chevy lowrider without a care in the world. I took aim, pulled the trigger, and the rifle jammed again. While Lee and I ran downstairs and crossed the street to the Red House, we found out the youngsters were unhurt, but my car window had been busted out. I denied knowing anything about what happened or being anywhere near that house. Later, there was a single shot drive-by at the corner of Santa Fe and Pine directed at a young Crip named Shotgun. The Red House was immune to any more violent disturbances, but Compton got hot for everybody. Meanwhile, I was still making the rounds like an ambassador on a public relations tour, meeting more and more Crips throughout Compton, on the East Side, Centerview, and other places. During that period, I met Pee Wee, commander of the JD, Jordan Down Projects, Crips on the East Side. There were 2 sides to these projects, with the dilapidated factory separating the 2 sides. When I started hanging out with the JDs, Crips existed on both sides and their numbers were equal to the PJs, if not slightly more. Pee Wee was dark brown, short and thin with an aggressive heart. He wore the longest cross and chain earring of any other Crip. It extended from his earlobe to his waist. Sometimes he jokingly said, "Cuz, there's this woman, such and such, who's well built, but she's real ugly. Any problems with that?" Then he starts smiling in anticipation of my response. "It's not the beauty, it's the booty." Pee Wee would burst into laughter at that, especially when he was loaded. The JDs, PJs, and the Grandees were like second homes to me. I'd visit each one often, sometimes all three on the same day. Three other Crip spots I frequented were Boot Hill, Park Village, and Centerview. Boot Hill was several sets of two-story apartments located on Alondra, next to a liquor store and directly across the street from the Park Village Crips. Less than 3 Crips actually lived in Boot Hill, yet 30 to 40 of us Crips and Criplets briefly commanded the property. Most of the time you could find Crips getting high or sitting up in second-story windows taking pot shots at Pyru cars, which triggered the Pyru's notorious sneak attacks. A lot of Crips hanging out at Boot Hill were from the Grandees. They should have been called the Grandees Boot Hill Crips. It became an active spot for Crips such as Big and Little Honcho, Mr. X, Popcorn, Tick, John John, and Bitter Dog Bruno, who was a character and a half. If Bruno wasn't warring against the Pyrus, he'd be challenging any Crip foolish enough to think they could outdrink him. Bitter Dog Bruno would turn up a fifth of Mad Dog 2020 with several giant gulps and finish it. The short-lived Boot Hill Crips lasted for a few months, which was how long it took the owners to get fed up with our presence and have the Compton cops make numerous arrests and then evacuate any remaining Crips from the premises. Things had gotten so petty around Boot Hill that the Compton cops arrested me for spitting on the ground. Other spots where I made my rounds was a huge area with many fine homes called Centerview on the outskirts of Compton. Mad Dog Wilson was one of the commanders of the Centerview Crips, though he often hung out at the Grandees and in Boot Hill. To get me to where Mad Dog Wilson lived, I had to drive down an extremely long street with a wall on both sides extending about a half-mile in distance. On the left-hand side is where the Centerview Crips lived, and on the right side, the Pyrus resided. As far as I knew, there was only one way in or out of Centerview on either side. Sometimes when visiting Centerview, Mad Dog, his homeboys, and I would attend parties on the rival side, looking for trouble and having no problems finding it. I never had any qualms about participating in any Crip feud. I felt it was my duty as King Crip not to kick back, but to be in the forefront of Crip wars. Plus, if I got hurt or MWGB murdered while gangbanging, it would be in the name of Crip, smash or be smashed. Mad Dog Wilson's AKA reflected his actions perfectly. Back then, he was making a name for himself using Mad Dog tactics. It was said that he was too bold for his own good, but then, that was true of all of us.